The photo, the stamp and the passport, what can you say you saw? You were in Paris, or in Cancun, or in Japan. The landscape was extraordinary. The moment was real. And at some point, in a very brief second, you paused the experience to document it. It's not a judgment. It's an observation. There was a silent question in every posted photo. A question that no one asked out loud. But that was at the root of every click on publish. Did you see that I went? Traveling was never just about visiting places. The belief about what traveling means will operate for decades. 1973, Brazil. Traveling was for the wealthy. Not the ostentatious wealthy, but the wealthy in the sense of having margin. Those who didn't have to choose between paying the electricity bill and going out. The lower middle-class family in Brazil in the 70s traveled in a specific way when there was a relative in another city. The crowded bus to the countryside. The uncle's house that had space. The beach by car, when the car existed, on a two-lane road with the whole family inside and the luggage tied to the roof. There were no resorts. There were no hotels with breakfast included. There was the improvised adventure of those who traveled with what they had to go where it was possible to reach. And for those who didn't travel, television showed what existed on the other side. Travel shows where blonde hosts visited European cities with names you could barely pronounce. Places that existed in a parallel dimension to your daily reality. One day I will see the world. Who from your generation hasn't said that? Or thought it, even without saying? It was a promise that childhood made for a future that seemed very distant, but that, for your generation, finally became within reach. The child you were didn't travel much, but already knew that traveling was a symbol of something, of possibility, of belonging to a world broader than the street where you lived. This idea of traveling as a passport to another version of yourself, that stayed. The discovery that you could exist in an unknown place, and that this existence had its own flavor. You were 16, 17 years old. The late 80s. The school trip, the graduation excursion, the week at a friend's house in another city. For the first time, you are in transit without your parents' supervision. And the destination matters less than the feeling, which is freedom with texture. Not the abstract freedom of being independent, the concrete freedom of being in a new place, without the family anchor, discovering that you can manage, that you can order food in a restaurant you don't know, that you can get lost and find your way. This trip installs something that will stay, the association between a new place and a new version of yourself. As if the geographical distance also created distance from the everyday version of yourself. And this distance was, for a few days, refreshing in a way that words don't quite capture. A good trip is one that takes you out of your comfort zone. This phrase, which will appear decades later in Instagram captions, begins to form in this first teenage trip. The intuition that controlled discomfort in a chosen place is a way to grow that routine doesn't offer. The first trip without parents was the prototype for all the trips that came after. Not because of the destination, but because of the discovery that you can exist in unknown territory, and that this discovery is worth repeating. Identity. You said, I'm the kind of person who goes anyway. 20 years old. Little money. A lot of time. Brazil in the 90s, the real stabilized, but the middle class was still finding its limits. You didn't have a budget for luxury travel, but you had energy, flexibility, and the willingness to sleep in a hostel with 8 strangers. And there was a unique aesthetic to this way of traveling that was both necessity and positioning. The backpack was a symbol. It said something about who you were, adventurous, independent, non-materialistic. Someone who travels for the experience, not for comfort. The stories that came from these cheap trips were better than any expensive trip could produce. Because the unexpected was guaranteed. Because improvisation was constant. Because you depended on people, locals, other travelers, whoever showed up along the way. And there was a silent competition among those who traveled on a budget, who had gone further with less, who had slept in the most unusual place, who had the most improbable story. These stories were currency. They circulated in groups, created collective identity, positioned those who told them. We took the bus. We slept at a guy's house we met along the way. It cost almost nothing. This phrase, told with pride, was not just logistics. It was a statement of character. It was, I am the kind of person who does this, who goes anyway, who doesn't need luxury to have a real experience. Traveling on a budget in your 20s was about freedom, but also about proving that freedom didn't depend on money, that you could get anywhere with what you had. This was perhaps the most powerful symbol of that phase, and the hardest to maintain when money arrived. You started to do a job that only the story of the trip used to do. The name of the place began to communicate before the story was told. 30 years old. Income grew. Time shrank. And trips changed in nature. It was no longer backpacking. It was a package. It was no longer a hostel. It was a hotel with a TripAdvisor rating. It was no longer I'll go and see what I find. It was a planned itinerary in advance. And along with the planning came something new, the destination as a symbol. Not just any beach, the right beach. Not just any European city, Paris, Rome, Barcelona. Not just any Caribbean, Cancun, Punta Cana, St. Martin. The destinations had hierarchy. And positioning oneself in this hierarchy, even if unconsciously, was part of the choice. Brazil in the 2000s was discovering mass international tourism. The strong real, more accessible flights, the middle class with passports. Traveling outside Brazil ceased to be an exclusivity and became an achievable aspiration. And this democratization created something curious, the need to distinguish within the category. It was no longer enough to have traveled. There was where you had traveled. And how. And with whom. We went to Europe in their summer. Off-season is much better. This phrase, seemingly about travel logistics, is actually about differentiation. Off-season signals knowledge, experience, sophistication. It's the equivalent of the 2015 Bordeaux at dinner. At 30, travel ceased to be just adventure and became narrative. You knew, while traveling, that you would tell. And this awareness, this presence of a future narrator in the moment of experience, began to shape what you chose to see, do, and record. In none of them. Because part of you was already back, in the story you would tell, in the photo you would post, in the reaction that would come. 40 years old. Instagram exists. Facebook is at its peak. And travel gained a completely new dimension, the public dimension, in real time. Before, you traveled and told later. There was an interval between the experience and the account. In that interval, the experience had space to settle, to become memory before turning into story, to be yours before being everyone's. With Instagram, that interval disappeared. The photo posted at the Colosseum was posted from the Colosseum, with the caption written while you were still there. The reaction from followers arrived before you returned to the hotel. The engagement was simultaneous with the experience. And this created something that no previous generation had to navigate, the dual experience. You were living the trip and building the account of the trip at the same time. Two parallel tasks, sometimes in conflict. Wait, let me take a photo first. How many times have you said that? How many times have you heard it? The meal that waited to cool down. The sunset that was seen through the phone screen. The child who asked for attention while you found the right angle. It's not a judgment. It's an observation of a pattern that your generation developed without a manual, because the manual didn't exist. You were the first to have to figure out how to live an experience and document it at the same time. And you discovered, with your body, the cost of that. The trip at 40 was real. The experience was real. But there was a silent question in every posted photo, a question that no one asked out loud, but that was present in every click on publish. Did you see that I went? Destinations, in intention. And this change is one of the most discreet and most important of the entire journey. You are 50 years old. You have traveled. You have stories. You have photos. You have posted. You have received comments. The first two have to reveal and wait to see what you had recorded. The first to transition to digital, to compact cameras, to cell phones, to Instagram. The first to document life in real time. And that's exactly why you are in a unique position to answer the question that the following generations will still have to ask. How to live an experience completely, without the distance of the account. The most important photo you took on a trip is the one that doesn't exist. The moment you lived fully, present, without a phone in hand. The photo that only exists in memory, and that's why it's the only one that won't disappear when the phone changes. Traveling to discover places is good. Traveling to discover who you are when you are far from everything that defines you at home. That is the destination that never disappoints. The symbol changes. The need remains the same. Until one day it ceases to exist. What was the most important trip of your life? Not the most expensive or the most photographed, but the one that changed you from the inside out. What happened there that you still carry? Seedling next week. Money, the most loaded symbol of T2, and the most controversial. At Posico Invisible Position EP04, traveling was never just about visiting places. At Posico Money was never just about buying.